Good morning. I'm Audrey Coleman, and welcome to the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics here in Lawrence, Kansas. As director of the Dole Institute, it's a pleasure to host you all virtually, along with our friends at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate in Boston. We're excited to share with you the culminating report of our Bolstering Elections project, which identifies possible paths to strengthen election administration infrastructure as a foundation for trusted elections. With a project as important as this, we're of course inspired by our namesakes, Senators Bob Dole and Ted Kennedy, for whom crossing the aisle was just doing the job they were elected to do, a type of leadership necessary to identify bipartisan solutions to complicated matters of public policy, including voting rights, civil rights, and many other areas. And here at the Dole Institute, in the light of the largest stained glass American flag in the world, visitors and students from around the country and worldwide of all ages are reminded that our nation is at its best when we find common ground and move forward together, respecting and investing in the processes and institutions and people that make our democracy work. I want to thank my friend, colleague, and trusted partner at the Kennedy Institute, CEO Adam Hines, for the opportunity to take part in this important work at this critical time in our nation's history. It's been a pleasure to work alongside you with your team and staff leads Emily Rapp and Catherine Slater. We're grateful for the support from Election Trust Initiative, our collaborator Avery Davis Roberts, and further thanks to Democracy Fund, whose support allowed us to host this exciting online event today. As you'll learn, many things about this project are very special. One, of course, is the diverse network of collaborators that participated in the creation of this report, led by our special advisor and nationally recognized elections expert, Tammy Patrick, about whom and from you'll hear more in just a moment. Another is reflected in the breadth of our audience today, in line with our public engagement mission at the Dole Institute. This morning, we welcome members and friends of the Dole Institute and Kennedy Institute and Dole and Kennedy alumni, alongside elections leaders and public servants, including members of the National Association of Election Officials, the National Conference of State Legislatures, the National Association of Counties, the Council of State Governments, and many more. We are so grateful for your tireless dedication to our elections and electoral processes, not just every 4 years, not just for national elections, but year-round and for jurisdictions at all levels. Thank you. Once again, on behalf of the Dole Institute, thank you for joining us today. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to you, Adam, over at the Kennedy Institute.
Great. Thanks so much, Audrey. And a warm welcome from the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, where, as you can see, we have an exact 1-to-1 scale replica of the United States Senate. And thousands of students come through these doors every day for experiential role play, civics learning about American governance and the U.S. Senate. In recent years, though, we've also expanded our focus to include programs aimed at strengthening American democracy. In particular, ways to ensure that the growing divisions in our country do not impact the functioning and trust in our governing institutions. We work directly with elected officials and policymakers to bridge divides so that our foundations remain strong. In all of our work on democracy, we prioritize reaching across the aisle when we can, and especially when it will result in more action. As you heard, that was the hallmark of the namesakes of our institutions. And that was the motivation for coming together with the Dole Institute for this critical project, because it's clear that the work of making election systems more resilient must be bipartisan, and solutions moving forward must cross party lines as well. I've thoroughly enjoyed this work with you, Audrey, and your team, and becoming friends along the way. At base, our aim has been in this project to support the heroes of elections, the administrators, frontline workers, and volunteers who make sure voters have a successful voting experience. Yet when you ask basic questions about how America funds its elections, from technology to payrolls and maintaining accurate voter rolls, the answer gets incredibly complicated and difficult to answer. And having an answer allows us to move forward towards identifying the ways we might further bolster American elections. And so that's the purpose of this project. And you are in for a treat, both during the conversations here today and when you dig into the chapters drafted by some of the nation's leading elections experts. It's a result of more than a year of work, as you just heard, as many of the authors first convened for this project in February of last year in Lawrence, Kansas, at the Dole Institute for a symposium that launched the effort. And the full report will be available to read at our website, emkinstitute.org, immediately following this program. I would also like to add my appreciation for the Elections Trust Initiative for their guidance and support, and the Democracy Fund for believing in the work that has been done here as well. Now, I have been incredibly fortunate to have the guidance, or we have as a collectively, the guidance of Tammy Patrick as a senior advisor to this initiative. Tammy is a nationally recognized elections expert. She has been working in the elections administration's field since 2003 as a local election official, speaker, educator. She served on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. She was the federal compliance officer for the Maricopa County Elections Department in Arizona for 11 years, and today she will moderate multiple panels of contributing authors. Tammy, welcome, and over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you both to Adam and Audrey, and for all of our speakers who've joined us today, all of them dear friends and trusted colleagues. This project has been an honor to participate in, and I would just like to personally thank both of the institutes, Audrey and Adam, Jackson and Catherine for all of their support, and all of our authors for their participation. So that you're aware, the report is really an anthology, compiling and highlighting the work of experts across 3 different fields: academic research, practitioners who are in the throes of this every single day. If it's a day ending in Y, there's an election administrator thinking and working on the elections ecosystem, and also the work of policy experts. These areas will really inform our panels today, as well as the way in which the report is laid out. So we're going to start off with our foundational discussion with 2 of our academics, Dr. Mitchell Brown and Dr. Zachary Mohr. Dr. Mitchell Brown is the Curtis Lyles III Professor of the Department of Political Science at Auburn University and is Director of the Institute for Election Administration, Research, and Practice. She has published numerous books, journal articles, white papers on election administration-related issues, and teaches a number of courses in the Certified Election Registration Administrator Project through the Institute. Dr. Zachary Mohr is an associate professor at the School of Public Affairs and Administration at the University of Kansas. He studies the cost of election administration at the local level and recently published the book, A Republic If You Can Afford It. How much does it cost to administer election? Thank you both for being here this morning. Professor Brown, I would like to start with you. We often talk about the decentralized nature of election administration, how even the terminology that we use when we're talking about an election official is inconsistent. There can be different titles depending on what state or jurisdiction they live in, whether they're called a clerk, an auditor, a supervisor, a recorder, a registrar, the list goes on. And that can complicate study. Your study of administration is steeped in these challenges. And I wonder if you might share with our audience today some of your key takeaways and the challenges that you've found in studying election funding.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tammy, and thanks for having me on this important webinar. We have at our institute been working on studies around cost and funding streams for election administration for about a decade now. And it is a lot of hard work. And so I'll say in advance, hats off to Zach for all of the amazing work he's been doing. When you look at election office budgets, the cost centers are largely similar. There are some differences, but understanding funding and cost in election offices is deeply complicated, in part because of the office structures that you just mentioned, but also because budgets are different, terminology connected to those budgets are different. We have different fiscal year starts, both across and within states, and the timing of elections, both across and within states, is also different. And all of these things then complicate how we understand both the cost of elections and how they're funded. We conducted at one point some research on budgets. We looked at 10 comparable states and got data on all of the counties in those states and created just a simple ratio of county budgets to election office budgets, and found that the average election office budget as a ratio of the county budget was only 0.5%. Now, there was a lot of variation in that, but 0.5% is not much money at all to something that is the foundation and undergirds American democracy. This is also critical because when we look at funding sources, counties are the largest funding source for elections because elections are fundamentally a local function. Funding sources beyond the counties themselves then expand to other areas. They get revenue from coordinating jurisdictions where there's been consolidation. In some states, the states will also fund or reimburse a portion of the election costs. We get HAVA funds from the federal level through the EAC, and there's also in some places private funding, though of course this has been significantly restricted in recent years. Studying elections then is further complicated by the way that county budgets are structured. In another study we conducted, we looked at every line item in the election office budgets in 7 counties within the same state. And what you would hope is that all of those line items would be exactly the same and everybody would be using the same budget structure and the budget terminology. But what we discovered was that the budget categories from these 7 different election offices didn't match across the 7 counties. And this adds another complicating factor to how we understand and making comparisons really, really difficult. I will add to this, again, we've been looking at this pretty deeply for about a decade, and we this year are excited to have some of the work on cost and funding of election offices culminate in a contest that we're holding that will, what we've done is put out a call for proposals for innovative ideas about how to fund election administration. We are very fortunate. We have $25,000 in cash prizes for the winners. We're going to invite the top 10 proposals to Auburn to present at a symposium in October. And the top 5 will split that $25,000 with the top prize getting $10,000. So there's a real incentive to come up with some innovative ideas. The host of this webinar has put the link to that call in the chat, but we are hoping to get some really good ideas and have a really deep conversation about maybe thinking of different ways to do this because it's so very important. Thanks, Tammy.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, this is, I think, the first time something like that has been done, if I'm not mistaken. And it's really an exciting proposal. I remember being astounded the first time I heard that statistic about the 0.5% being the average for those who had been surveyed of the county's budget. And we know from other chapters in the book that people will want to dig into that the bulk of funding of our elections actually comes at the local level, not at the federal or state level. So we see a winnowing amount of resources as we look deeper and deeper into this. Professor Mohr, I want to turn to you next because you have spent years studying the cost of elections in a number of states. And although there are many challenges to that research as well, around how much things cost, the question of who is paying the bill for those expenditures can be even more complicated. And I would just love for you to share some of the points that you make in your chapter on this topic.
Thank you, Tammy. Yeah, I would like to also thank the Dole and the Kennedy Institutes for putting this together. This has been a lot of fun. And I really appreciate the opportunity to get to highlight Kansas counties because Kansas is a bit of a small state, but I think it's representative in a lot of ways in that we have, clerks that run the elections that have lots and lots of different duties. And so it's a good chapter in that it's looking at a group of counties that aren't often looked at. So some headlines from the chapter are that 92% of the funding comes from property tax resources. As a public finance person, I would say that's actually good because it's a very stable resource. And so it makes the funding streams are pretty constant, but it might not be growing as much as we'd like. So that's a bit of a problem. And only 37% of the counties had sufficient revenues to cover all of their expenses. So in our chapter, Kansas has 105 counties. 101 of them the elections are ran by the county clerks. And so we're only looking at the 101 smaller counties. I'm actually in the largest small county right now, and that's Douglas County with approximately 80,000 registered voters. And in the elections world, people often use Douglas County as an example of a small jurisdiction. In Kansas, Douglas County is a very large jurisdiction that maybe has a lot of resources. So what I'm going to be talking about are the smaller counties, the ones that range from our smallest county is under 1,000 registered voters all the way up to Douglas County with its 80,000 voters. So the data comes from the annual financial reports from, at the time, the most recent presidential election. And so we looked at those financial reports and saw how many of them listed the expenditures and how many of them listed the revenues. 78 of the 101 listed their expenditures for elections, and 35 of them lined out their revenues for the funding of the election administration in their county. And so that was very interesting. We found 21 different funding sources. But as I said, 92% of that, of the funding for elections still comes from property and vehicle tax, which is essentially a form of property tax in Kansas. And so it's really interesting to see the variation. Kansas is a home rule state that has lots and lots of variation in what is allowed. But at the end of the day, fundamentally, they're getting it from pretty much one or two sources. In terms of adequacy, we highlight the adequacy because there's wide variation at the highest levels. So one county had, I think, over 160% of their expenditures were funded by their revenues, so they clearly had enough money. But two counties had less than 20%, and the average funding of the elections in these 37, 38 counties was 37%. And so there is clearly a need for more revenue for election jurisdictions in Kansas. These very small ones, which are the ones that I often worry the most about. We also talked a little bit about the state. The state has tended to use its HAVA funding for things like voter registration and cybersecurity. And so there are very few direct transfers or payments from the state to the local governments. Although in 2024, I was very happy to see Secretary of State Schwab secured $1.9 million of funding for the smaller counties for cyber and physical security. So I believe this is really a step in the right direction. And so the big picture here is that it's actually probably a good thing that the election administrators fund most of their elections through very stable resources like the property tax. But there's probably a need for more diversification so that it can grow with the growing need. And we may need more transfers from the higher levels of government. So that's what we highlight in our report. And it's a fascinating, great opportunity to finally start looking at the funding streams of elections, which are critically important.
Thank you so much, Professor Mohr. I think, when we think about election administration, we often talk about, things like the digital divide or the variation from urban, resources versus those in the rural areas. So I love that a lot of your focus is on what is actually happening out in the bulk of our offices in this country, because 75% of our election offices are those small rural offices, and they only serve around 8% of the American electorate. And we know from one of our other authors in the report from Reed College, from the Election Voting Information Center, is that 8% of our election offices actually serve 75% of the electorate. So there's a real tension there on what the needs are, and as well as the resources available. At our event last year in Kansas, it was lovely to be on your campus, and thank you for being, and at the Institute being such gracious hosts. But one of my favorite quotes was from a local election official who was talking about the tension between elections in, for lack of a better word, competition with other departments like public health and education. And she said, if only I could paint my voting equipment caterpillar yellow, I might get it replaced more than once every decade. So I love that you highlight the great variety across the state. And we know even more so that there can be variety from one state to the next, which is the perfect segue into our next panel. So I want to thank you both for being here today and for participating in the report. Your contributions make it that much better. So thank you both for your time today. We're going to pivot to the next panel, which is our practitioner experiences. And we'd now like to welcome a few of our practitioner authors to join us. They have conducted elections under varying levels of funding in a variety of states. First, we'll have Hilary Rudy, who is the Colorado Deputy Elections Director and has been with the Colorado State Elections Office since 2006 and works closely with county election officials to implement new processes and procedures. In addition to her work as Deputy Elections Director, she chairs the Committee on Ethics in Practice and is a member of the Council of State Governments Overseas Voting Initiative. Thanks for being here, Hilary. We're also joined today by two United States Election Assistance Commissioners. Both were nominated and approved by unanimous consent in 2019. That was a thing, unanimous consent. We don't see a lot of that. So it's lovely to have both Commissioner Palmer, who is the current EAC chair and has served as Virginia's chief election official and as a Florida director of elections. Prior to his work in election administration, he served as a trial attorney with the voting section at the United States Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. It's a lot of alliteration in there, and the U.S. Navy Intelligence Officer and Judge Advocate General. Thanks for being here, Commissioner and Chair. Commissioner Hovland served as chairman of the EAC in 2020 and 24. His leadership during a truly unprecedented time for election administration has helped transform the EAC to better support election officials and voters across the United States. Prior to his work at the EAC, he served as acting chief counsel for the United States Senate Committee on Rules and Administration and as the deputy general counsel to the Missouri Secretary of State's office. Welcome, Commissioner Hovland. Thank you as well for being here. So welcome to you all. It's wonderful to see you. I'd like to start off with you, Ms. Rudy. Colorado is one of the states that does fund, at least partially, the conduct of elections, of some elections in the state. And for those of you who are wondering why I'm saying that very purposefully in that way, the funding of elections can really vary whether it's a municipal election. Is it for mayor? Is it a school board election? Is it a legislative district for the state? Is it a congressional district? Is it president? The funding of all these types of elections can vary even in a single state. And so in your chapter of the book, you discuss how the state of Colorado, which does provide some funding and some support to the local counties where the elections are conducted, because for most of our states and commonwealths, in fact, that's who's conducting the elections. I'm wondering if you could share with our audience today some of the insight about the changes that are happening in Colorado and what brought those changes about.
Absolutely. Thanks, Tammy. And thanks to the Institutes for the opportunity to contribute. It's a really cool opportunity and a cool opportunity to talk about the change that we are seeing in Colorado. So beginning with the 2024 general election, our funding model for county conducted elections is moving to reimbursement of 45% of actual reimbursable costs. So how we got here is that historically we reimbursed on a per voter basis only when the state certified a ballot measure in a November election. And so that formula most recently was 90 cents per active voter in counties with 10,000 or fewer active voters, and 80 cents per active voter in counties that were larger than 10,000 active voters. So the arguments in favor of making this change are probably pretty familiar in terms of reasonable cost sharing for the content. So a per voter formula fails to account for things like drastic changes in supply costs due to things like supply chain challenges, or changes in legislative priorities. So new requirements around voter services, or upgrading security requirements, or new voting equipment. And it also doesn't account for how much content is certified. So if the state was certifying 14 measures to the ballot in November, it was still 80 or 90 cents per voter based on size, the same as if we certified a measure. And so the amount of space taken up on the ballot wasn't accounted for either. So as we made this change moving into 2024, we were able to rely on a change that started in 2020 with a presidential primary. So beginning in 2020, we saw our first presidential primary in 20 years. But it was under a different model. So under Colorado's current semi-open primary mail ballot model, but it also had a funding mechanism. So the state reimbursed counties full actual and direct costs for a presidential primary. And so we started with the 2020 presidential primary, well, actually in 2018, planning for that, trying to determine how are we going to budget for that? How do we know what this is going to cost? It's different than the last time we did it. And so forecasting was incredibly difficult, not just because of the model and the way we do the election, but because we then had to take unaudited self-reported data from the 2018 state primary and use that as a basis for budgeting. And we learned a lot in that process. What we really learned is that when you're budgeting actual and direct costs, the election model, technology, supply costs, all of those things factor into what an election will cost. And when you're running it on a completely different model, those make real changes in costs. And because the estimates were based on state primary costs, we learned that different elections have different cost drivers. Fiscal years matter too. Professor Brown talked about this in her presentation. Different jurisdictions have different fiscal cycles. The state runs on a July to June fiscal cycle, but many of our counties run on a calendar year fiscal cycle. So that makes a difference in terms of budgeting and planning as well. We also learned about workload. So in the previous formula, it was pretty easy to predict and plan for what that reimbursement would be. It rose at a pretty steady pace, consistent with increases in voter registration and active voter counts. Easy for us to budget for, easy for the counties to plan for. That isn't the case when you're talking about paper and printing and changes in vendors over time and equipment upgrades and things like that. All of those really can change and drastically change actual and direct costs. And so for the counties, what this means is adding to their workload in terms of maintaining invoices and receipts and documenting costs clearly. And then for the state, it means auditing those cost expense reporting and the underlying documentation before issuing reimbursement. So increases workload on both sides. And in 2020, the first go at this, it was all done through email. And so it was challenging to track and create a record of those submissions. And if you can imagine trying to transmit invoices and receipts and all of the documentation that underlies those costs as email attachments. And so looking ahead, we knew we needed to make some updates. So heading into the 2024 presidential primary, we created a online form and a document holding location where counties could enter the information online, upload forms directly into their folders. That way it would make it easier for us to exchange information and review the information that the counties provided. That went much more straightforwardly, and it still required a lot of cycling with the counties to make sure we got the correct information, but much easier. And then leading into the 2024 general election, we updated the form. We added more instructions based on our conversations with the counties. We numbered the sections to make it easier for us to communicate about which section we needed information or documentation about. And the form still breaks down in the same 8 reimbursable categories, everything from temp staff and election staff overtime to judges' pay to printing to postage, all of the same 8 categories. But we also added some information around non-reimbursable costs, which we had been tracking, but we're beginning to track more robustly. Because although our reimbursement is based on reimbursable costs, tracking non-reimbursable costs is giving us a more full picture of what an election really costs and what it costs over time. So where we're at now is we've completed the first 45% reimbursement cycle, so much more straightforward than the first 2 goes at this. We're continuing to make adjustments to the form and the document collection folders. We're doing some planning sessions and working sessions with our county partners to try to make the process less cumbersome on both sides. But what we have found is that this change has had real meaningful impact on county budgets, and most impactful on our smallest county budgets. So where a larger county might have seen their reimbursement double from what a per voter sum might be, our smallest counties have seen it increase in factors of 5. So it is a significant increase in funding at the most local level for our elections. And looking ahead, we're planning for 2 45% reimbursements in our next state fiscal cycle. It's going to be continue to be challenging to plan and budget for this. We really think it's going to take a full 4-year cycle to fully understand cost variances between elections and what cost drivers are going to drastically increase or decrease those costs. Things like paper, printing, and supply costs tend to vary widely from election to election. And as we know, election law changes can really have an effect on county costs. But now we have one good data point for a presidential election as we move forward. But those of us who like data know that one good data point is one good data point. So we're looking forward to getting many more data points as we move forward and continuing to track what this means to county budgeting. And I'm excited to see how this looks over time as we start to look at primary elections, coordinated elections, and more general elections.
I love that it's interesting, you mentioned the number of initiatives, and there's often a discussion about paying for real estate on the ballot, and who's getting, location, and not paying anything, which of course that means the top of the ballot and federal races. But a number of authors mentioned that very notion in the report. And I love that you also discussed some really practical challenges with the review of data and information and some of the ongoing important areas for election administration to gather data and to be able to consume it in an effective way. And our report really does call for some further research on some of these issues. So as a data geek and election nerd myself, you're speaking my love language. You had me at data point. And I think that's the perfect place to pivot to our commissioners, because they of course have the EVES survey, and are the clearinghouse of a lot of this information around election administration from a variety of perspectives. So commissioners, I'd love to now pivot to your chapter and the role that the federal government has really played in election funding, which has really only been since the passage of the Help America Vote Act that really established the EAC. I believe Commissioner Hovland, you're going to go first, if I'm not mistaken. So let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tammy, and thanks to the Kennedy and Dole Institutes for really engaging in this way. I think that in the federal government, as we've heard so far, or we've heard a lot of conversation, that State and local governments run elections. State and local governments are primarily responsible for funding elections, but there is an important federal role, which really did come around because of the Help America Vote Act of 2002. That's the legislation that created the Election Assistance Commission. That was Congress's response to the Florida 2000 election and some of the election administration issues there. It's always good to be able to bring up hanging chads or butterfly ballot in an election conversation. And so in many ways that kicked off, of course, the existence of the AC, but also the federal government's investment in elections. In the history of the country before then, the federal government had not funded elections at all. And what we've seen since then is through different pots of money, about $5 billion from the federal government. We know that's a drop in the bucket to what it costs to run elections. That's probably about what it costs to run elections in 1 year, if you look at the state and primarily local costs. But again, it's an important piece. Most of that money came at the beginning of with the passage of the Help America Vote Act and those first few years afterward. You saw the Help America Vote Act directed the replacement of punch card voting systems. There was money for that. It required the implementation of statewide voter registration databases and other plans to improve federal elections. And so we really saw the bulk of that funding come in that first decade. We then had a number of years without any federal funding for elections. And then in 2016, we saw attempts of foreign interference in the elections. In 2017, you saw election infrastructure designated as critical infrastructure. And then starting in 2018, Congress sort of turned on a little bit more of the grants from the federal government to states. And we've seen that number vary, but appear more years than not. So in 2018, there was $380 million of HAVA security grants, then $425 million in 2020, $75 million in 2022 and 2023, $55 million in 2024, and then only $15 million in 2025. So that trajectory is obviously headed downward. But one of the other things there that we see is sort of the inconsistency in that. We hear a lot from election officials about both the importance of federal money, the way that it helps support their offices or new efforts and innovation, the impact that can have on the broader election community. But we hear about a desire for that funding to be consistent and predictable. And so in our article, one of the things we talk about is the importance of that, the partnership of that, thinking about how the federal government can play a role participating in funding. Again, it's never gonna, it shouldn't ever replace the state or local portion, but it has a critical component. And I think that is even sort of more apparent to me now than ever as elections have become harder to administer. They've become more expensive in recent years, and that makes the federal investment all the more important. I know Commissioner Palmer is going to take over with some specifics there, so I'll turn it over to him, or back to you, Tammy.
No, this is the perfect segue. Commissioner Palmer, Chairman, what would you like to add to that?
Well, a couple of things. Thank you, Tammy, for moderating this panel. I then thank my colleague for those comments and the Dole and the Kennedy Institutes for allowing us to talk about elections in a report in a chapter that we did. I think it's apparent that successful elections really is a key priority of the federal government, and good services require an investment. So the rubber meets the road when the voters cast the ballots, and so across America, what you're seeing is voters have multiple options in voting, and the legislatures are providing in-person opportunities early in election day, absentee and mail-in votings, and those are multiple options. That costs money, and so it requires an investment for good services. Voter education, the ways and means of casting ballots and the insight on how ballots are counted is becoming more essential to an election administrator to be able to communicate to the public. So the election officials, and some of my experience has been using HAVA grants for those eligible costs that are related to staffing, operations, equipment and infrastructure upgrades, security upgrades, and in my opinion, the fundamentals of improving elections and the security of elections. In my opinion, the EAC sort of plays a key role with that in developing voting standards and encouraging the security enhancements. So we have a front row seat as some of those costs that are with us now and will be in the future as election technology increases. We want to keep pace with technological advancements, and that's the real key. One reason we adopted VVSG, which is the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines 2.0, to really improve that security and functionality of the next generation of systems. So that can be exciting, but the potential of VVSG 2.0 and those new systems may not be fully realized for years unless we have dedicated state and federal funding for localities to complete that transition. You know, while I have this little platform, I would also mention the budget of the EAC. We didn't talk too much about that. We talked about what the EAC did, but I think that the state and the states and the election community find significant efficiencies when with the development of national standards and testing and evaluation and the certification process of voting machines. You know, lower or significantly lower budgets will reduce services and assistance. Failure to adequately fund the EAC will remove a key aspect in the protection of our voting machines. And that is not the direction that the country needs to be going in. So I would just conclude that continued strong federal investment in partnership with states is really crucial to maintain and enhance our election systems. The HAVA funds have always been a strong driver of innovation in my experience to find long-term efficiencies with new technologies. Long-term funding is necessary for election officials to ensure the integrity of the election process. And we know that that plays a corresponding role in public confidence and safeguarding our election process. Tammy, that's really what I have sort of on moving forward on where I see the importance of HAVA grants.
Well, we certainly appreciate all of you being here today and all of the work that you do both in your states and nationally. Episodic funding is certainly a challenge. Having a reliable stream is so important, and that is one of the running themes throughout the report from all the different types of experts that we have from both sides of the aisle. It's not so much a question of exactly what the bottom dollar amount is. We can debate that and what level of that funding is necessary, because there's a lot of differences of opinion around that. But having something that's reliable is key. And I think, you know, your average voter, your average American, your average person can understand that, knowing that you're going to have a check every 2 weeks, knowing that you're going to be paid on the 1st and the 15th is one thing, and you can budget appropriately. But if you don't know when or if you're ever going to get any more money, that's why we do have states and municipalities and local governments that are still holding back on some of those funds and not spending them. They're saving it for a rainy day because they don't know what's going to happen, when they're going to need more funding, or if they're ever going to get any additional funds coming in. So it's one of those things that in elections we like to say, well, one size doesn't fit all. But in this moment and in this case, there are things that we definitely agree on, and that is that episodic funding, while it's nice to have funding, it should be a reliable stream. So thank you all for being here today and for the work that you do on behalf of the American electorate. And we're going to pivot to our final panel. I knew this hour was going to just fly by, and here we are. It's the final panel discussion of the day with our experts, policy experts, and we have with us Rachel Orey, who is the director of the Bipartisan Policy Center's Elections Project, where they're responsible for the organization's election administration policy and professionalization efforts. Their research focuses on evidence-based and data-driven reforms that create secure, accessible, and trustworthy elections. Orey currently serves as the adjunct professor of computer programming at Georgetown Law and has a Master of Public Policy and Certificate of Data Science from George Washington University. Welcome, Rachel. Dr. John C. Fortier is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on Congress and elections, election administration, election demographics, voting, including absentee voting, the U.S. presidency, and the Electoral College. He is also continuing his work on the continuity of government. So thank you both for being here today. Rachel, the Bipartisan Policy Center has been working with election officials on funding issues for some time. Your chapter discusses some of the challenges that you found and also some possible solutions. So I wonder if you might share some of that with us today. And I believe that you're going to share some graphics with us. Excellent.
Yes, doing my best.
Turn it over to you now.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tammy. And thank you to the Dole and Kennedy Institute for pulling this together. I'm going to, walk through a little bit about the research that the Bipartisan Policy Center has done on federal funding for election administration and talk about one innovative idea that we've been circulating for a couple of years on how we might create that regular funding stream that Tammy talked about. So first, looking into the background of what do we know about election administration and the need for federal funding. This is really going to just put a fine point on a couple of the points that were raised by the prior panelists. So first, we know that elections are a highly local operation. They're administered by around 10,000 local and state election officials who work long hours to ensure that elections are free, fair, and secure. Over the last 2 decades, really since the 2000 election and since the passage of the Help America Vote Act in 2002, elections have become increasingly complex and resource intensive. We know that the demands on election officials have continued to grow while staffing levels and salary have remained largely stagnant. So in other words, that's more and more being put on the plate of the same people without additional support or compensation. We also know that over the last 2 decades, elections have become subject to threats that transcend jurisdictional boundaries. These include things like malign foreign interference, misinformation, threats, and harassment. Problems that are much bigger and beyond the scope of one, municipal election office to try to solve on their own. So from my perspective, that underscores the importance of federal funding and investment in fortifying the infrastructure and capacity of election administration as a field to respond together to some of these bigger challenges. Finally, we know that resource constraints underpin nearly every logistical, administrative, or perception challenge that election offices face. Election officials barely have enough resources to cover core functions, which leaves them in a bind when there are legislative changes that levy new expectations on an election office, and leaves them unable to innovate or dedicate funds to new security or access initiatives when the resources that they have are often being wholly dedicated to these kind of basic core functions of election administration. When it comes to the history of federal election funding, what has it been like over the last couple decades? We know that federal funding has helped election offices perform these core security and access functions that I mentioned. So last year, BPC worked in partnership with the Election Assistance Commission to evaluate the use of federal election security grants, looking at how election offices have used them between 2018 and 2023. And we found that federal funds typically went to these core integrity, security, audit, voting system functions, which speaks to the central role that federal funding plays. It's not going to these, superfluous extra activities. It's really going to day-to-day responsibilities like making sure voting systems are new and up to date, protecting IT systems from cyber attacks, improving the accuracy of voter rolls, voter communication, making sure polling places are accessible, and auditing election procedures and outcomes. So just again, these are the most critical functions of an election office, and federal funding has been a core part of making sure that those things happen. Here's a chart of how funds have been spent, election security grants distributed by the EAC. You can see that the top 3 places that they go are cybersecurity, voting equipment, and voting processes. And yet, despite the critical role that federal funding plays, it has met only a small portion of the total cost of election administration. The commissioners mentioned this in the last panel, but federal funding really is a drop in the bucket of the total cost of running elections in the United States. Here you can see that the total cost of running elections is about $5 billion per year. So thinking back to the start of the Help America Vote Act in 2002, that's over $100 billion in the total cost of running elections. Meanwhile, over that same period, Congress has supplied just over $5 billion in federal funding. So that's just about 4.5% of the total cost of running elections. And making matters worse, federal funding has been on the decline in recent years. So you can see that in 2018 and 2020, we saw higher levels of federal support for election administration. But over the last couple of years, it's been a lot lower, closer to $55 million, and then more recently in the $15 million range. So we see this declining and unreliable support for election administration from the federal government. Now moving on to what we do about it. So BPC is not unique. Like Tammy said, there's a lot of agreement in the field that Congress should create a regular and predictable stream of federal funding for elections. We've typically recommended something in the $400 million per year range. But like she said, that is open to reasonable debate and conversation. What I think is different about BPC's recommendation is that in recent years, we've been making the suggestion that the Presidential Election Campaign Fund might be the best way to create a predictable funding stream for election administration that is kind of protected from the political conflict of the annual appropriations process. So for some quick background on the Presidential Election Campaign Fund, or the PECF, it was created in 1974 to fund parties' general and primary election campaigns with the goal of reducing the influence of money in politics. So to this day, taxpayers are given the option to allocate $3 of their taxes or $6 if they file jointly toward this fund. In its first year, it collected nearly $24 million, which is equivalent to about $120 million in 2024 dollars. Yet, despite the fact that taxpayers continue to get the option and continue to choose to dedicate some of their tax liability to this fund, no major party candidate has utilized the Presidential Election Campaign Fund since 2008. Rather, we have seen that the Presidential Election Campaign Fund has been used to support election administration funding. It's just in a kind of roundabout way. So when Congress has passed federal funding lately, they've drawn from this fund, but tax filers still think that they're contributing to this Presidential Election Campaign Fund. So that kind of creates a precedence for it supporting election administration and maybe indicates a need that we should formally reclassify this. To give you a sense of how much this could create in a regular funding stream for elections. We know that right now, this fund hasn't really been used in a couple decades. There's no big communication around it. We see about 3% of tax filers contributing to the Presidential Election Campaign Fund. And that's far lower than in 1978 at its peak, when we had almost 30% of tax filers choosing to contribute to this fund. So if we were to set that as our goal, if we were to reclassify the Presidential Election Campaign Fund, maybe rename it, really communicate with voters and tax filers about what this fund is being used for, maybe we could get back up to that 28% level in the future. And if we were to reach that amount, we would have an annual stream of $200 million to support election administration. And that's keeping the $3 or $6 amount. There are also suggestions that we might increase that amount and get us closer to that $400 million per year. And this is all while protecting that annual stream of funding from the congressional appropriations process and giving voters a direct stake in funding free and fair elections. I think it could be, beyond supporting election administration, a great exercise in educating voters about how elections work and giving them, again, that direct stake in making sure they're continuing to be run and run well. So thank you. These are the two reports that this presentation pulled from, in addition to the section that we put in the report. I think we're going to drop those links in the chat as well. So I will pass it back to you, Tammy.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. And that raises a really important point, is that this report is kind of a distillation. It's a synthesis, it's a synopsis, it's a summary of many of our authors' very robust academic publications and research. And so we're seeing this as a starting point. It's a menu of thoughts and ideas for you to contemplate and to dig in deeper. So now I want to turn to you, Dr. Fortier. Over the years, your work has certainly bridged many of the topics that we've discussed here today. You and I have contemplated them and discussed them ad nauseum. And so what I would like for you to do now is, if you could please just share with us a little bit of what we might find in your chapter, and why is it that this conversation and this work really does transcend party lines and partisan ideology.
Well, thank you, Tammy. And I will add my fellow panelists' thanks to the Dole Institute and the Kennedy Institute. I have had the pleasure, actually, I had the pleasure of having some interaction with both Senators Dole and Kennedy. They were really lions of the Senate. And while I haven't been to the Dole Institute in person, I have visited the Kennedy Institute, both under construction with hard hats and some other senators, and then at the opening in that beautiful reconstruction of the Senate. So I think it's great that the institution of Congress and the Senate is looking at elections. And thank you to you too, Tammy. Let me say a few things. I actually come to this looking at and thinking about the process that might lead to funding, the process of trying to understand costs and needs, which is very difficult, as many people have noted, in the decentralized election system that we have. I'm very grateful to Zach and Mitchell and other political scientists for trying to really figure out, what we spend on elections, how much things cost. But the decentralization really is an issue for local government officials, local election officials who are seeking money from their county boards, or for state officials, even just trying to explain what their needs are, what they need to do, how much things cost, because you can't simply say, oh, well, it's just like it is in the state next door, or there's a template. And so, I want to highlight a few processes, which I think the processes for working your way through cost sharing really make ultimately more information available, more transparency, and hopefully up the likelihood that we'll have good information for funders to really say, hey, this is what we're really looking to fund. So I'll start. And again, I'm glad Hilary was there to describe Colorado. I have a little shout out to Colorado in my paper, more as a kind of model that other states might like to adopt. I mean, in very different ways. In each state, even states that don't think they're providing much funding for locals at the state level, there is a lot of interaction between state and local election officials. There are different ways in which the states are set up to have authority in various places, but processes like voter registration, whether your state is more of a top-down or a bottom-up state, the voter registration process involves both, and both local and state have to provide for that, have to fund, have to provide that function. You also have the issue not only of decentralization, but that in almost every state there's a difference in what the localities look like, from sometimes places with very large counties or very large cities to very small places that are all having to administer this election, but ultimately have to do so with very different resources and very different understandings of what they need to do. And so Colorado, I think, is an example of working through a process by which, whether it's for direct funding or just really understanding needs, where the needs are, and having localities really be able to explain what their needs are in their particular way that the state runs elections. Also, all sorts of in-kind funding that we can think of that states might provide, whether that's polling locations, personnel, IT functions, and also sharing of information between large counties and small counties. And again, sometimes sharing actual actual functions. So I think that process is one that is very valuable, and other states should take that on as much as they can, because it's the process itself really does improve the information for the purposes of funding. If I move to the federal side, several people gave a good account of our federal funding. I mean, a simple point is that we didn't fund anything at the federal level before the Help America Vote Act, before Bush v. Gore, and shortly thereafter. And even then, our big funding process, I think, for a long time was thought of as maybe a one-time funding. And then recently we've seen some more emergency or smaller annual funding come through that process. Again, I want to emphasize the process here. The HAVA grant process that was set up, it's very difficult for Congress and the senators on the institutions sponsoring this talk will know how difficult it is to send out federal money to a decentralized activity, whether there are formulas and how much to give to each state and what is the reporting back. And Congress did set up this HAVA grant process, which is extensive. It made some decisions as to how the money should be spent. The jurisdictions report back. There is oversight of that funding, ultimately by the committees in Congress, also by the Inspector General. And that process, if we hadn't had that process in place from the original HAVA grants, it's hard to imagine how we might have quickly pivoted to doing some emergency funding in later years. And so I think that process as well will serve us well going forward. Making the case for federal funding is not, is likely to happen if there really isn't information coming back, opportunities and oversight. And really, compared to all the many other functions that we often use in Congress to get money out to states and to localities, the HAVA process is really a robust process where there is much more information, much more oversight. And so, it's something I think we want to preserve. Two last points. I think if we are going forward with federal funding, whether that is more permanent or more regular, we should, as we did in the first HAVA grant process, really think a little bit about crafting funding that is, on the one hand, regular for average annual needs, but also to remind ourselves that we do have these major capital expenses that are made for purchasing election and voting equipment. And HAVA, of course, HAVA grants have been allowed to spend that money over time or to wait to the cycle of when that happens. But I think that's an important feature that Congress would have to wrestle with and want to think about. Let's make sure that not only there's some funding on a regular basis, but also that we understand that the regular capital needs over a decade or a longer period of time where new election equipment is going to have to be created or purchased is very important. And finally, I guess I make a plea to have the federal government think a little bit about all of the ways in which the federal government does conduct elections or is part of the process of conducting elections. There are very established and very well laid out entities like the EAC or like FVAP in the Defense Department, which have budgets and have a long history, and I think both authorizers and appropriators understand where that money is going. But there are also some other places that spend money, whether it's CISA, which I know is probably changing and lessening their funding, but that was not done through a direct congressional authorization. Also the work in the post office, the work that goes on in the Justice Department. And so thinking a little bit more robustly about all of the ways in which the Congress could look at federal funding and say, we know all of the pieces of the federal government that are contributing to that election, and we should think about it in a holistic way. So my last just summary is essentially all of these things are process oriented, and they may sound like they're too in the weeds and too boring, but I think they're very important for people who want to make the case of what you need for elections to be able to get money to the right places, and then to have oversight and people who are funding these be able to really see how that election funding is performing in the real world, and these processes ultimately will help with the election funding world.
Thank you so much. I think that's exactly right. Understanding the ecosystem, knowing what all the data points truly are, is the only way that we can make informed decisions and move forward on good policy. You know, you mentioned in-kind donations, and I immediately think of 2020 when hand sanitizers and other materials, you know, there was a lot of donations to the conduct of elections in 2020 in the midst of a global pandemic. But in almost every election, there are in-kind donations for polling places, facilities not charging the local election office to use their community room or the basement at the church or the gymnasium at the school. There's a lot of very common in-kind donations and contributions that are often very difficult to track. And so here we are back at the data discussion. So thank you both for being here today. It's truly a pleasure to talk to you both. And I would just like to close us out because this has been, I think, a great conversation and summation of some of the things that you'll find in the report. We by no means have covered all of it, but I think it gives you a good sample and a good understanding of what the report is. And as I mentioned previously, this project has quite simply been an honor to participate in. I would just like to personally thank the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics and the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, both Audrey and Adam, Jackson and Catherine, and all of our authors for their participation, and for all of you being here today. The report will be available on websites later today, as Adam mentioned, and I think the link will be dropped in the chat right about now. As well as on electionline.org, which electionline.org is your resource for nonpartisan news on election administration. Our hope is really that this report will be an educational tool and will be something that election administrators can use in telling their story. As was mentioned before, we need to make sure that we understand where we're at so we can inform where we're going. We're hopeful that it's going to be used by policymakers, stakeholders, and the electorate at large to better understand the needs of our election administrators and what it takes to ensure free and fair, secure and accessible elections for all voters, no matter who they vote for or what issues or initiatives they support. This is truly an issue for all Americans to come together on, and I want to thank you all for your time today. Enjoy the report. We had a great time writing it.